The Zhou Dynasty is one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history, but it is also one of the easiest to misunderstand. When many people think about ancient China, they imagine powerful emperors, a unified empire, strict laws, giant walls, and a centralized government controlling everything from the capital. But the Zhou Dynasty was not that kind of China. The Zhou came before the first emperor, before the Qin dynasty, before Imperial China as we usually imagine it. And yet, in many ways, the Zhou created the mental world that later China would live inside for more than 2,000 years. The Zhou dynasty lasted from around 1046 BC to 256 BC, making it the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history. But it did not stay the same for all those centuries. It began as a powerful royal house that defeated the Shang dynasty, then slowly transformed into a loose world of rival states, ambitious lords, military reforms, political thinkers, and constant warfare. By the end, the Zhou king still existed, but his power was almost symbolic. The real power belonged to states like Qin, Chu, Qi, Jin, Zhao, Wei, Han, and Yan. So the story of the Zhou is not just the story of one dynasty. It is the story of how ancient China moved from Bronze Age kingship toward the world of empire. It begins with a rebellion that had to be explained as something more than a rebellion. Around 1046 BC, the Zhou people, based in the west near the Wei River Valley, challenged the Shang dynasty. The Shang had ruled before them, centered around the Yellow River region, with powerful kings, bronze rituals, oracle bones, ancestor worship, and royal sacrifices. Later Zhou sources describe the last Shang ruler, Di Xin, often called King Zhou of Shang, as cruel, arrogant, and morally corrupt. According to the Zhou version of events, the Shang had lost the right to rule because its king had become unworthy. The Zhou leader, King Wu, marched east, defeated the Shang at the Battle of Muye, and founded a new dynasty. But here is the important point. The Zhou did not present their victory as simple military conquest. They claimed that heaven had transferred its support from the Shang to the Zhou. This idea became known as the Mandate of Heaven, and it became one of the most powerful political ideas in Chinese history. The Mandate of Heaven said that a ruler had the right to govern only if he ruled with virtue, order, and responsibility. If a dynasty became corrupt, violent, or incompetent, heaven could withdraw its mandate. Rebellion, disaster, famine, and defeat could then be interpreted as signs that the ruling house had lost cosmic approval. This was a brilliant idea politically, because it justified the Zhou conquest of the Shang. But it was also dangerous, because once you say bad rulers can lose heaven's support, you create a logic that can be used against every future dynasty, including your own. The Zhou used the Mandate of Heaven to explain why they deserved power, but later rebels would use the same idea to explain why other dynasties deserved to fall. In that sense, the Zhou created a political weapon that outlived them. After the conquest, the Zhou faced a difficult problem. Winning a battle is one thing, governing a large territory is another. The Zhou could not rule everything directly from one capital. The world they inherited was full of local powers, former Shang elites, regional cultures, military leaders, and distant territories. So they built a system often compared to feudalism, though it was not exactly the same as medieval Europe. The Zhou king granted lands to relatives, allies, and loyal followers. These local rulers were expected to support the king, provide troops, perform rituals, and maintain order in their regions. This system is often called fengjian. At first, it worked because many of the regional lords were connected to the royal family by blood or marriage. The idea was simple: spread trusted people across the land, bind them through kinship and ritual, and create a network of loyal states under Zhou leadership. The Zhou king stood at the top as the son of heaven, the person responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, ancestors, and human society. This was not a modern state with ministries and police in every village. It was a ritual political order. Power flowed through family ties, noble ranks, ceremonies, military obligations, and shared belief in Zhou legitimacy. One of the most important figures in the early Zhou was the Duke of Zhou. After King Wu died, his young son became King Shang, and the Duke of Zhou acted as regent. Later, Chinese tradition remembered him as a model of loyalty, wisdom, and statesmanship. He helped stabilize the new dynasty, suppress rebellion, and shape Zhou political culture. Confucius, who lived centuries later, deeply admired the Duke of Zhou and looked back to the early Zhou as a golden age of ritual order and moral government. That admiration matters because the Zhou became more than a dynasty. It became an ideal. For later thinkers, especially Confucians, the early Zhou represented a time when politics, morality, family hierarchy, and ritual were supposed to fit together. Whether that idealized picture was completely accurate is less important than the fact that it shaped Chinese political imagination for centuries. The early Zhou period, often called the Western Zhou, had its capital near present-day Xi'an, in the region of Fenghao. This was a world of bronze vessels, ancestral temples, noble lineages, chariots, ceremonies, hunting, warfare, and agriculture. Like the Shang, the Zhou used bronze ritual vessels, but Zhou inscriptions became longer and more historical. These inscriptions recorded grants, achievements, royal commands, family honors, and political events. They give us valuable evidence of how Zhou elites understood power. Bronze was not only art, it was memory. A vessel could preserve a family's status and connect descendants to ancestors. In Zhou society, remembering your ancestors was not private nostalgia. It was political identity. To belong to a noble lineage meant knowing who came before you, what honors your family had received, and how your place in society was connected to ritual rank. This is one reason ritual was so central to Zhou life. Ritual was not just religion, it was social order performed in public. It told everyone who stood above whom, who owed loyalty to whom, who could use which vessels, who could perform which sacrifices, and how noble families should behave. In the Zhou worldview, a stable society depended on each person knowing their role. The king had duties, lords had duties, sons had duties, fathers had duties, younger brothers had duties, older brothers had duties. The family became a model for the state, and the state became an extension of moral hierarchy. This is one of the roots of later Confucian thought. But the Zhou system had a built-in weakness. The same local lords who helped the king rule distant lands could grow powerful over time. A lord's land could become a hereditary state. His family could build its own army, economy, and identity. Generations later, those regional rulers might feel less like servants of the Zhou king and more like independent powers. That is exactly what happened. Over time, the Zhou king's control weakened, while regional states grew stronger. The system that had helped the dynasty expand slowly became the system that pulled it apart. The turning point came in 771 BC. The Western Zhou collapsed after attacks by enemies from the west and internal political disorder. Later tradition tells a famous story about King You of Zhou and his favorite consort Bao Si. According to the story, King You lit warning beacons to amuse Bao Si, causing nobles to rush to the capital for no real emergency. After being fooled, they stopped trusting the signals. Later, when a real attack came, help did not arrive in time. This story is memorable, but historians treat it carefully because it comes from later sources and may be moralized. Whether every detail is true or not, the broader point is clear. The Zhou royal house suffered a major disaster. The capital in the west was lost, King You was killed, and the Zhou court moved east to Luoyang. This marks the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. From this point on, the Zhou king remained important in name, but his real power was greatly reduced. The Eastern Zhou is usually divided into two major eras, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. These names may sound poetic, but the reality was harsh. The Spring and Autumn period, from 770 to 476 BC, was a time when regional states competed for influence while still formally respecting the Zhou king. Powerful lords claimed to act in the name of restoring order, defending civilization, or protecting the royal house. In practice, they were building their own power. States formed alliances, betrayed alliances, absorbed smaller neighbors, and fought repeated wars. Yet war during this earlier period was still often shaped by aristocratic codes. Chariot warfare was important, noble lineages mattered, ritual language remained influential. But the old order was already breaking. One of the major developments of this time was the rise of powerful hegemons known as Ba. These were rulers who dominated other states while claiming to support the Zhou king. Duke Huan of Qi is one famous example. With the help of his minister Guanzhong, Qi became one of the strongest states of the Spring and Autumn period. Guanzhong is often associated with practical reforms in administration, taxation, military organization, and economic management. This points to a larger trend. States were becoming more organized, more competitive, and more focused on survival. The old noble world was giving way to a harsher political reality. Talent began to matter more. Administration mattered more. Population, agriculture, taxation, iron tools, and military mobilization mattered more. This was the beginning of a long transformation. During the same broad era, China also saw an explosion of thought. The Zhou world was politically unstable, but intellectually alive. As the old order weakened, thinkers asked urgent questions. What makes a good ruler? How can society avoid chaos? Should people be guided by ritual, law, virtue, nature, or power? This period eventually produced what later became known as the 100 Schools of Thought. The most famous thinker was Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BC. Confucius looked at the disorder around him and believed the answer was moral restoration. He admired the early Zhou and believed society could be repaired through virtue, proper ritual, respect for family hierarchy, education, and humane government. For Confucius, politics was not just about control, it was about character. A ruler should govern through moral example. If the ruler is upright, people will follow. If the ruler is corrupt, laws and punishments alone cannot save the state. Confucius did not become politically successful in his own lifetime, but his ideas later became one of the foundations of Chinese civilization. Another major tradition associated with the late Zhou world is Taoism. Figures such as Lao Tzu and later Zhuangzi emphasized a very different way of thinking. Instead of trying to repair society through ritual and hierarchy, Taoist thought often questioned artificial social rules and urged people to align with the Tao, the natural way of things. Where Confucianism often focused on moral duty and social order, Taoism could sound more skeptical, more paradoxical, and more interested in simplicity, spontaneity, and the limits of human control. Legalism was another powerful school of thought, and it became especially important in the state of Qin. Legalist thinkers argued that moral preaching was not enough. A strong state needed clear laws, strict rewards and punishments, centralized authority, agricultural production, military discipline, and administrative control. In a world of constant war, legalism offered rulers a brutally practical question: not what is morally beautiful, but what makes a state powerful enough to survive. This intellectual competition is one of the most important legacies of the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou did not give China one answer. It gave China the debate. Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, Mohism, and other traditions all emerged from the pressure of a world that was losing its old order and searching for a new one. By the time we reach the Warring States period, from 475 to 221 BC, the transformation becomes even more intense. The Zhou king was now almost politically irrelevant. The real story belonged to the major states fighting for dominance. Warfare became larger, more organized, and more destructive. Chariots became less central as mass infantry and cavalry grew in importance. Iron tools and weapons spread. States built walls, registered populations, expanded agriculture, and developed bureaucratic systems. Armies could number in the hundreds of thousands. War was no longer mainly a noble contest. It became a total state project. This is why the Warring States period feels so different from the early Western Zhou. At the beginning of the Zhou Dynasty, politics was built around kinship, ritual, and aristocratic hierarchy. By the Warring States period, rulers cared more about administration, law, military efficiency, land, tax revenue, and direct control over people. The state was becoming colder, stronger, and more impersonal. Among the rival states, Qin eventually became the most successful. Located in the west, Qin was once seen by some eastern states as rough or less culturally refined. But Qin had major advantages. It controlled strategic territory, expanded into fertile lands, adopted major reforms, rewarded military achievement, weakened old aristocratic privileges, and built a highly disciplined state. The reforms associated with Shang in the 4th century BC were especially important. Qin reorganized society around agriculture and warfare, imposed strict laws, promoted merit-based military ranks, and strengthened central authority. These reforms made Qin feared and effective. Other states had brilliant thinkers, rich cultures, and powerful armies, but Qin built the machine that could conquer them. Meanwhile, the Zhou royal house faded into the background. In 256 BC, Qin ended the Zhou dynasty formally, but the larger Zhou world did not truly end until 221 BC, when Qin conquered the remaining rival states and created the first unified Chinese empire under Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. That is the great irony of Zhou history. The Zhou began by overthrowing the Shang and creating a moral vision of rulership based on heaven's mandate. They built a decentralized order through noble lineages and ritual bonds. But over centuries, that order broke apart into competition, reform, and war. Out of that breakdown came the tools of empire: bureaucracy, mass armies, legal codes, territorial administration, and centralized power. The Qin Empire, which ended the Warring States period, was in many ways born from the ruins of the Zhou order. So what did the Zhou dynasty actually leave behind? First, it left the mandate of heaven. This idea shaped how Chinese people explained political legitimacy for thousands of years. A dynasty did not rule forever simply because it was strong. It had to deserve rule, at least in theory. When disasters, rebellions, and corruption piled up, people could say the mandate had been lost. Second, the Zhou left the idea that politics and morality are connected. This became especially important through Confucianism. Even when later rulers behaved ruthlessly, they still often had to speak the language of moral government. Third, the Zhou left ritual culture. The ordering of family, society, rank, ceremony, and ancestral respect became deeply influential. Fourth, the Zhou period gave rise to China's great classical philosophies. Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, Mohism, and other schools were not abstract inventions in peaceful classrooms. They were responses to disorder. They were survival theories for a broken world. Fifth, the Zhou created the political conditions that led to unification. The dynasty itself weakened, but the competition among states forced reforms that eventually made empire possible. For foreign viewers, the Zhou dynasty can be compared in some ways to a long transition from the Bronze Age to the age of centralized states. It begins with something like sacred kingship and noble land grants, then moves to aristocratic warfare, then into a period of large territorial states, reforming governments, and philosophical crisis. It is not one simple story. It is almost 8 centuries of transformation. That is why the Zhou can be hard to summarize, but also why it matters so much. If the Shang dynasty gives us the first clearly proven written roots of Chinese civilization, the Zhou dynasty gives us the framework of Chinese political thought. The Shang asks questions through bones. The Zhou asks questions through history. Who has the right to rule? When does power become illegitimate? Can morality survive politics? Is order created by virtue, law, ritual, or force? Should a ruler act like a father, a judge, a general, or a machine? These questions did not disappear after the Zhou. They continued through Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, and even into modern discussions of power and society. The Zhou dynasty is not famous in the West in the same way as Rome, Egypt, or Greece, but it deserves to be. It lasted longer than almost any major dynasty in world history. It produced some of the most influential political and philosophical ideas in East Asia. It shaped the language of legitimacy, rebellion, virtue, hierarchy, and order. And it shows one of history's most important patterns. A system can survive in name long after its real power has moved elsewhere. For centuries, the Zhou king remained the son of heaven, but the states beneath him were becoming stronger than the throne above them. The title survived, the ritual survived, the memory survived, but the political reality changed. That is one of the deepest lessons of the Zhou. Power does not always disappear all at once. Sometimes it drains away slowly while the symbols remain standing. A king can still sit on a throne while generals, ministers, and regional rulers decide the future. A dynasty can still have a name while the world it created has already moved beyond it. And yet, even in decline, the Zhou shaped what came next. Its failure produced China's philosophers. Its fragmentation produced stronger states. Its rituals gave later thinkers a vision of order. Its collapse gave later rulers a warning. The Zhou dynasty began with a claim that heaven had chosen a new ruling house. It ended in a world where states no longer waited for heaven to decide. They built armies, passed laws, counted households, taxed land, and conquered rivals. That shift changed Chinese history forever. The Zhou started as a dynasty of bronze, ritual, and noble kinship. It ended as the doorway to empire. And that is why the Zhou matters. It was not just the longest dynasty in Chinese history. It was the age when China argued with itself about what civilization should be.